Hi, I'm Alicia Kinchlow with Kinchlow Law, and today we're going to talk about what happens to debt in a divorce, specifically what happens to student loan debt. Now, often when there's a divorce, people think about what happens to the money, right? We think about who is going to get the house, who's going to get the equity in the house, who's getting the retirement funds, and who's going to get alimony, which are payments that happen after the divorce. We don't always think about or talk about, well, what happens to the debt? And a lot of times families have an abundance of debt. So it's important for us to have that conversation. Now, today's topic is specifically around student loan debt. As always, these videos are for informational purposes only, so you want to make sure that you speak to an attorney licensed in your area about the facts specific to your case. But student loan debt, as we all know and probably read in the news, is at an all-time high. And people are incurring debt sometimes before the marriage and sometimes after the marriage. So let's talk about first, what is the definition of marital debt? Marital debt is debt that is occurred from the time of the start of the marriage until the date of separation. Now, in some situations, interest that continues to accrue can be considered debt even after the date of the separation, but typically we're talking about any debt that starts from the date of the marriage until the date of the separation. And so one of the main cases that we think about when we think about student loan debt is the Hicks versus Kubit case. And in that situation, you have a couple who have been married for a relatively short amount of time. Both of those individuals had more or less the same earning potential. They were earning, I believe, $30,000 a year and $35,000 a year, had the ability to do so. But the wife had significantly more student loan debt. Now, she had taken out some student loan debt prior to the parties getting married, and then she had taken out some debt after that. And what's important is in this conversation, in this case, is not just what happened to the student loan debt, but how it was used. And I think that's a key thing that you want to make sure you think about, because sometimes when people are incurring student loan debt, they're not just using it specifically to pay the institution. They're actually using it to live. And that was what happened in this particular case. The wife took out about $37,000 or $36,000 after the marriage and deposited $13,000 of that money into a joint account to be used for joint living expenses. And the husband also took out a loan from someone else for about $9,700. So when it came down to looking at what is marital debt, by definition, the student debt that the wife took on after the marriage is marital debt. But when it came down to who's responsible for it, that's where the key is. So the courts found that the amount of money that was used for both parties, that $13,000 that was put into a joint account for their joint living expenses, was going to be something that the court was split between the two parties. And that $9,700 that the husband took out that was used for both parties was going to be something that was going to be split too. And the court actually split it on a 60-40 split. So the wife filed an appeal basically stating that she felt that the interest that accrued from her loan that she took out prior to the marriage, about $11,000 or $12,000, and the full amount of the $30-something thousand that she took out after the marriage of student loan debt should have been considered marital debt that was able to be split between the parties. And the court said no. They looked again at how the student loan debt was used. So the majority of the debt, that money outside of the $13,000, was used for the education and sole benefit of the wife. Now, in other cases, we've seen the argument that, well, the other party has the ability to benefit from whatever comes from that increased education. So if it's now because I have this debt, I'm able to have a different profession and I'm able to earn more money and they're able to receive additional retirement or alimony, they should be responsible for it. The courts have historically said no. Generally, that person is not going to be responsible for your education debt. So when it comes down to arguing your case before the court, and when you're looking at equitable distribution of your assets and your debts, you want to make sure that you look at how did you use that student loan debt and provide proof. If you use some of that income to be able to support the family while you were getting your education, show proof. Show that you deposited into a joint account. Show that you gave it directly to the other spouse and they put it in their account and they had control over it. Those are things that a master or a judge, when deciding how to split the assets and the debts, can use to make sure that you're not solely responsible for student loans that you guys really use together. And then the other part of that is that when it comes down to figuring out alimony and how the assets are going to be split, remember that there's 17 factors, and I've talked about this in another video, that the court will consider when deciding whether to award alimony, how much alimony to award, and for how long. And so if someone has an enormous amount of student loan debt, that can be something, even though the master or judge may not make the other spouse responsible for it, that can be something that they use to determine, well, how are we going to actually split these assets and how much alimony is this other person going to be responsible for. So again, it can be a factor, even though it may not be debt that can be split between the two parties. All right, so I hope you found this video informative. Make sure you hit subscribe so you can get tips like this in custody, support, and divorce. And again, as always, make sure you speak to a lawyer licensed in your area about the facts specific to your case. All right, until next time, take care.